Hiya, and really good to be with you today. And we're going to be concluding our series on Ecclesiastes, this book in this wisdom literature in the Old Testament, part of the wisdom literature that we've been working our way through over a number of weeks now, and called this series Finding Meaning in a Messed Up World. And I came across a video the other week called The Meaning of Life. And I wonder if you were going to make a video with that title, I wonder what you would want to say in that about the meaning of life. And this particular video was about a man called Herbert Fingert. He's a 97-year-old philosopher, spent his life loving wisdom. That's what philosopher means. Philos from love, and Sophia, wisdom. One who loves wisdom, one who loves knowledge, and gives their time and their thinking and their life to the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge and understanding. And in this video, he's reflecting. He talks about life being messy, but actually he has the desire to want to live as well. And he reflects on the inevitability of his own death, and talks about this book that he wrote called Death, the Philosophical Soundings that he once wrote. And he says this in the video. He said, "In a nutshell, I wrote that there is no reason to be concerned or afraid about death, because when you die, there is nothing. I now think," he says, "that is not a good statement, because I think it's important to figure out why people are afraid of death. It's something that haunts me, the idea of dying. What is the point of it all? What is the meaning? There must be something I'm missing. I wish I knew." After a lifetime of studying and reading and writing and reflecting and thinking and pondering, he comes to the conclusion and the end of the matter, when all is said and done, and he says this: there is no point. There's no point. There's no ultimate meaning in life. And we're coming to the conclusion in Ecclesiastes, and we've been exploring the words of this writer, this teacher, this aged sage, and maybe as he reflects on life, a lover of wisdom, looks back. Is there meaning in pleasure? Is there meaning in possessions and power and success and suffering? When I look at the oppression in the world and the harm that goes on in the world, where do we find meaning in these things? And he starts to bring his thoughts into land now in chapter 12, Ecclesiastes. So if you've got a Bible, do turn to that, Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And I'll read a few verses here from the beginning. He says this: "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain, when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men stoop." He starts to reflect on old age here, and some of it maybe is metaphor. This next verse: "When the grinders cease because they are few," maybe talking about teeth and starting to lose teeth in old age. "And those looking through the windows grow dim." Maybe he's thinking about our eyesight growing dimmer. I'm not quite there with glasses yet, but I don't think it's far off. Verse 4, "When the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades. When people rise up at the sound of birds, but their songs grow a bit faint." There's a sense here of maybe his hearing fading, his eyesight going, his teeth falling out. And he goes on in other verses to reflect on things that are coming to their end. They're coming to the end of their life. And then he concludes kind of when all is said and done, after thinking and pondering and reflecting and searching, he says in chapter 12, verse 8, "Meaningless, meaningless," says the teacher. "Everything is meaningless." Thankfully, that's not the end of Ecclesiastes. It's not the end of the book. Now, it reflects the start of the book where he came in, as he says in chapter 1, verse 2. It's meaningless, but it's not the end of the matter. And so we go on and read in chapter 12, and we start to now read maybe the words of a narrator, someone who's reflecting on the words of the teacher in Ecclesiastes, and says this: "Not only was the teacher wise, but also he imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words and sought to write words of truth correctly." Here maybe the narrator, as he reflects on the words of the teacher, he acknowledges his diligence, that he taught, that he pondered, that he searched out, that he arranged, that he took time to think, he took time to ponder the big questions of life. He didn't just avoid them, but he confronted them. And it's really important in life that we don't go through life and not ask these questions. Is there meaning in life? Where have I come from? What's going to happen when I die? How should I live? These are key questions to meaningful existence in this world. And it's really important that we give time over to exploring these things. It's very easy just to get on with the kind of daily stuff and busy ourselves and so on. But here the writer is being commended for pausing, for stopping and for thinking. And maybe different seasons we go through in life that we hit. Sometimes it's through difficulties and suffering that cause us to ask these big questions. Different ages of life, maybe as we grow older, maybe through lockdown and through COVID, through this season. Maybe you've had a bit more time to reflect, maybe you've had less time because you've been run off your feet. But it's just important that we do ask these big questions, and the narrator commends the teacher for doing so. And then verse 11 says this: the words of the wise are like goads. They're collected sayings like firmly embedded nails, given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. He says, the words of the wise are like goads. A goad is when you goad someone, maybe you've heard that phrase used, it's a pointed stick that was used to prod cattle or other animals, as it were, to point them get them going in a certain direction. And the narrator here is saying that the words of the wise are like that. They're like goads. They prod us and they make us think. They might stir us to action. But the question is where do we look for wisdom? Where do we look for the words to live by? Whose words of wisdom do we ultimately believe, and whose words of wisdom do we build our lives on? Where do we start? Where do we end? Verse 12, he says, be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Be warned, endless devotion to books is wearying. I don't know if you know how many books there are in the world, and I did a little search on this, and when you Google it, I think when Google was starting to try and put all the books of the world online, this is back in 2010, they came up with a figure of around 130 million books in the world. So I thought, well, how long would it take to read all those books? How long would it take to read them all? And so, of course, someone has done the hard work on this already. Now, I don't know how factual this is or whatever, but they came up with this with their calculations. That to read all the books in the world, if you spent 12 hours a day, and on average you could read a book a day on that basis, it would take you 350,000 years to read all the books in the world. Of much study is wearying. We're never going to do it. We're never going to get through them all. And that's not including all the podcasts, all the YouTube videos, all the tweets, all the words that are put out there, and different people saying, live life like this, follow this way, do this is how you better your life. Whose words do we listen to? What hope have we got of finding answers in our short lives? Whose words do you believe? In verse 10 we just read that the narrator says that the teacher sought to write truthful words, words that do describe life under the sun. His intention was to find truth, but the narrator now casts doubt on the outcome of his conclusion. Yes, it's true, it's a messed up world, but that doesn't mean that it's all meaningless. And so we come to the final words now in Ecclesiastes, verse 13. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this applies to every person. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. It applies to everyone, he's saying. When all is said and done, fear God and obey his commands. I don't know how that sounds to you. Maybe you think, yeah, absolutely on board with that. Or maybe you think that just sounds really outdated. It sounds really old-fashioned, and quite frankly, it sounds really quite oppressive. I guess how we react to those words depends on our view of God, or whether we even believe there is a God. I mean, again, there's so many books that have been written. There are so many religious texts Which ones do you believe? Is it everything is God, there is no God, that God's your best mate, maybe God's your worst nightmare? I don't know what you think about God. Or maybe just think it's just impossible. We're never going to know. We can never know answers to these questions about whether there is a God or what God is like. Is there any hope of finding the truth about God with so much that has been said and so much that is written? Where do you look for truth about God, and ultimately who do you look for truth about God? And maybe the Bible is the last book you'd ever look at, and perhaps Jesus that the Bible speaks about is the last person, the last one that you would ever go to. But the writer of Ecclesiastes is speaking about this God that the Bible speaks about, the one that Jesus said, I've come to reveal, that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The one that Jesus said, actually all this stuff that is written, it points ultimately to me. And Jesus echoes the words of the narrator as well. Jesus talks about listening to what he says and doing what he says, obeying his commands. And Jesus talks about fearing God as well. And we may think that that word, when we hear fear God, I think that Nike have got a brand of trainers I think I came across called Fear of God trainers. Not that that's particularly relevant to what I'm saying, but the point is it can sound a negative concept to fear God. But actually when the word is used in this context about God, it is speaking about a reverence, it's about a respect, an honour, an obedience, a trusting in. It's a reverence of God. It's not this kind of cowering in the corner kind of, God is just a harsh, horrible, whatever, big sort of, guy with a beard in the sky with a big stick or whatever. That's not. It's a reverential fear. The Bible uses words like the clean fear of God. It's reverence for God. But why would you fear God? Why would you listen to the God of the Bible? Why would you pay attention to Jesus and what he says? Well, ultimately, it's because of who he is and who we are. In Luke chapter 5, into the New Testament now, there's this story in Luke's Gospel about Jesus. Jesus has been teaching the crowds, and the crowds are kind of pressing in. I guess he's near the shore of the lake, and there's a boat there, and he wants to get in the boat to teach the crowds from the water. So he gets in this boat, and this boat's owned by Peter and his fisherman mates, and he teaches the crowd. And then after he's finished teaching and speaking, he says to Peter, Peter, let's go and do a spot of fishing. Now Peter's been out all night. He's been out fishing at night time. He's got, he's probably tired, exhausted, but he's been listening to Jesus teach. And as he hears Jesus say, let's go do a spot of fishing. He's caught nothing all night. It says that, he says, because you say so, I'll put the boat out and we'll go fishing. And in the story, they put down the nets and they put up this massive catch of fish. What is Peter's response? Well, it's not, Jesus, that's a brilliant fishing technique you've obviously got there. Could you please teach us it, because our profit margins are going to go through the roof. It's not, let's go have a barbecue and cook this fish. His reaction is this. It says, Peter fell at Jesus' knees saying, get away from me, because I'm a sinful man. Peter gets a glimpse of who Jesus is, and in light of who Jesus is, exposes Peter for who he is. That actually he hasn't lived an ultimately good life, that he's not totally pure of heart, and that he has sinned, he has done things that are wrong. And it caused him to say, get away from me, there should be distance between me and you. He recognises something of the presence of God even with who Jesus is in that moment. In the Old Testament, in Isaiah, there's a bit where Isaiah has this vision of God, and his reaction is, woe is me, I'm undone, I'm a man of unclean lips. I recognise actually, wow, in the presence of holiness, I've got a problem. And in verse 14, as we read out there in Ecclesiastes, it says that God will judge every act, both good and evil. And again, you might think, what God will judge us? God will judge the sin in the world, the evil in the world, and the Bible says yes, and Jesus talked about this a lot as well. You might say, well, that's not loving, surely, to judge. And in our world, we shouldn't judge anything or anyone. It's not loving to judge. But just imagine this. Imagine that you were, you had a friend, a really good friend or a member of family that had been hurt by someone, seriously hurt by someone. And they were up in court. This person who's hurt them was up in court, and you knew they'd done wrong. And the judge says to them, well, yeah, you've done wrong. You are guilty. This does deserve punishment, but do you know what? Because I'm a loving judge, I'm just going to let you off. You just go, no problem at all. Is that a loving thing to do? Well, of course it isn't. And we'd never say that in that moment. You see, for God to not judge the evil in the world and in our lives, that's an unloving thing. It does not make him a loving God. And the Bible says that God is love, and God loves justice. And so love does judge. And Jesus, like I said, spoke of judgment. If you read through the Gospels and Matthew 24 and 25, Jesus speaks about this judgment. But love also warns. And so Jesus, when he speaks about this, it's not to give us a hard time. It's just say, look, actually there's this God. God is love. And every deed, everything will come into judgment. But the beautiful thing about the story of the Gospels is that love doesn't just judge. Love doesn't just warn us, but love also acts. And when you read on in Luke's Gospel, and you go to chapter 23, and Jesus, when he talked about judgment, it was just before he was going to go to the cross, and he was going to stand as the one judged in our place, the one who takes that punishment for sin in our place. And in Luke chapter 23, he's crucified, Jesus is crucified between these two criminals. And it says, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Well, save yourself and us. Come on. If you're God, if you're the one who's come to rescue, can't you just rescue us from this situation? But the other criminal rebuked him. And he said this, don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence. We're punished justly, for we're getting what our deeds deserve. That's what justice is. Justice is people getting ultimately what they deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong, speaking about Jesus. And then Jesus said to him, he said to Jesus, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. This man hanging on a cross, he knew that he'd done wrong. And there was a fear of God there, and it didn't lead him away from God, it led him closer to God, it led him to God. He was humble enough to admit he got it wrong, that he needed forgiveness. And back at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, it says of God in chapter 1, Luke 1 verse 50, his mercy extends to those who fear him. This is Jesus' response to those that would go, do you know what, I know I've messed up, I know I've sinned, I know I need forgiveness. Jesus' response is mercy and grace. And to Peter, who said, away from me, distance, I'm a sinful man, Jesus says to him, no, don't be afraid, because he's got his sin covered, he's got his failure covered. This is the wonderful good news of God's grace to each one of us. Yes, we read through Jesus' words, you read through the Sermon on the Mount, and you go, I don't think I can live this, I know I fall short of this. And it's wonderful that as a Christian, if you're a Christ follower, we don't live from a place of trying to impress God with how well we live our lives and all the rest of it. We are secure in our relationship with God based upon what Jesus did for us on the cross, that it's all of grace. And then we live out following what Jesus says from that place. That's our starting point. Our starting point is God's mercy, God's grace, and God's forgiveness. And that's the starting point for the Christian life, that we live from that place. His mercy extends to those who fear him, those who reverence God, those who recognize, yes, God is real. Yes, this is who I am. This is who God is. I need mercy. I need grace. And we cry out to him, and he gives it wonderfully to us. Jesus' words, when you read them, they cut through all the billions of words that have been said, all the millions of books that have been written. I'd encourage you to read the Gospels for yourself if you've never read them. But they're like goads. We talked about this, the narrator talks about the teacher saying the wise man's words are like goads, like this sharp stick that prods us, that seeks to lead us in a specific direction. Jesus' words, his warnings, his invitations, his teaching is to lead us closer to God, to bring us close to himself, to restore our relationship with God, not push us away. But they're like goads, they prod us, and God can be like that. I remember when I first started going to church and I'd hear people read from the Bible, I think, wow, this is prodding me. This is a bit like, oh my goodness, this is provoking me to think about some things which are really, really important. And God's like that. He goes after people. He's the good shepherd. He seeks and saves what is lost. And reading these verses in chapter 12, verse 1, I was reminded of my wife Jean and her story when she went away from God. She grew up in church a bit, and then at about 16, 17, just kind of rejected it all. And we went away travelling together, worked on these private yachts, and we were in Barbados once, and working on this yacht, waiting for the owner to come. And I didn't know anything about this till years later, but during that time, Jean just felt prompted to go and buy a Bible. So she went and bought a Bible and tucked it away and hid it away. I never saw it. And then one morning she said she woke up and she felt a prod to go and read her Bible. And so she got a Bible, she went up onto the aft deck, and I think the sun was rising early morning. And these are the words that she read in chapter 12. She just randomly opened her Bible, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 1. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And for Jean, that was like words from God, wise words from God, kind of a prod saying, hey, don't forget, I'm still pursuing you, even if you're not pursuing me. This is what God is like. And sometimes people think, well, God's words, God's commands, they're restrictive, that God is kind of a killjoy, that he wants to ruin our fun, and we read what he says. But it couldn't be more opposite than that. It's like one way it's been described is, imagine playing sport, if you're into sport, whether it's tennis or football, or I'm quite getting into Formula 1 at the minute. In every sport there are rules, and there's a way of doing things. There are boundaries to stay within. And those boundaries, those rules, those commands, if you like, are there to enhance the game, the enjoyment of the sport itself. If you didn't have any of those things, actually people would get hurt and people would get damaged. And God's commands are the same. They're there to bring us life, to help us to live life in all its fullness. The Bible says that God gives us all things to richly enjoy in the way that he is designed to enjoy them. God is not a cosmic killjoy. His words are there to lead us to mercy, to grace, to forgiveness, to ultimately to know that we are deeply loved and forgiven. The philosopher, as I said at the beginning, is one who loves wisdom, one who pursues wisdom, one who's trying to find answers to life's meaning. And the love of wisdom really is ultimately the love of God. It's the putting first what God says, recognizing who God is, ultimately revealed in Jesus, and listening to what he says. Jesus says the wise person who builds their house on the rock, who comes to him, hears what he says, and puts it into practice. That's a wise way of living life, of hearing what Jesus says about the human condition, hearing what Jesus says about what God is like, taking Jesus at his words above every other word spoken and written. And it applies to all of us. Herbert Fingert took soundings on life's big questions, and he came up empty. He said there back at the beginning, what is the point of it all? There must be something I'm missing. I wish I knew. The teacher of Ecclesiastes kind of does the same, meaningless. It's a chasing after the wind. And here the narrator points us, though, beyond his writing, meaningless, towards God, that's ultimately revealed in Jesus, who is the wise man, who is the teacher, who is the shepherd. And he says, to those who listen to my words, those who follow my ways, you find solid ground under your feet, and you find meaning in this messed up world. Thanks for listening. I'm going to hand back to Goff now, who's going to lead us through the rest of our time together. Really good to be with you.